Friedrich Nietzsche said, remember, when you look into the abyss is looking back. And I always think, and certainly Sell expresses the idea, whenever you turn on your cell phone and punch in a number and push send, you're listening to the ether, to a whole interconnected electronic network, to an ear, and that ear is listening back to you. Once you connect, you're open to whatever. And that makes me uneasy. I got the idea for Cell out of a clear blue sky. It was one of those lightning strike ideas. Sometimes ideas accrete very slowly, and sometimes they come like they're delivered in a kind of aha moment, almost fully loaded, cocked and locked and ready to go. I was coming out of a hotel in New York, and this was probably 5-6 years ago. There are people at Scribner's, actually, who would know better than I would, because I brought the idea up almost immediately because I started asking geographical questions. I was that excited by the idea. My wife and I were staying at a New York hotel, and we came out of the lobby into that area underneath the overhang where the limousines and taxi cabs pull up. And there was a woman standing there, and she was talking on her cell phone, and the doorman was next to her, and he was hailing her a cab. And I thought, for no reason whatsoever, I wonder what would happen if that woman got a message over her cell phone that drove her crazy, and she just started to attack people, starting with the doorman next to her. And she continued to attack, homicidally attack people with whatever she had, her teeth, her fingernails, a nearby cement urn, whatever, until she was literally brought down and killed. And I thought that, frankly, the doorman would be very easy meat, because he certainly wouldn't be expecting an attack from this well-dressed, mink-wearing, high-heel-wearing woman who was waiting for the cab. From there, I immediately jumped to the idea of, if it's her cell phone, it's everyone's cell phone in New York City. And from there, I jumped to the idea of, if it's everyone in New York City, it's everyone in the world who has a cell phone. And from there, the idea fell immediately into place, because I was thinking to myself, well, I don't have a cell phone, therefore this wouldn't happen to me. And it became the story of a man without a cell phone who would have to try and get out of the city and get back to his family. And the story built itself very, very quickly on those lines. And the only reason that I didn't immediately rush back to my hotel room from where I was and start writing it, because the idea was that good and that natural, was because, frankly, I didn't know how to escape from New York. I didn't have a good geography, and frankly, New Yorkers are very, very, I don't want to say conceited, but that's the only word that comes to mind. They're very, very picky about how people describe their city. They tell you you've got it wrong if you call the uptown side of a street the downtown side of a street. They always know where is east, where is west, where the theater district is, and woe is you if you get it wrong. So I started to ask questions about the geography. What would be the quickest way out of New York City if you were going to New England, or if you were going to New Jersey? And I got conflicting answers about that. So I didn't know exactly what to do or how to handle that. So the idea kind of sat on the back burner for a long time, strictly because I was in a kind of geographical lockdown on the subject. And then I got involved with writing a book about the Boston Red Sox called Faithful. And that year I spent almost all summer, it seemed, in Boston. And I got very, very familiar with that city. I drove in and I drove out. I got very familiar with the geography of Boston. And at some point, I was on a walk one day, and a very logical thing happened. I said to myself, you don't need to make this story happen in New York just because that's where you got the idea. Why don't you set it in Boston? And it's just one of those things where something so obvious, it's so clear and so much in front of you that for the longest time you don't see it. It's like you're so fixated on this one unattainable girl that goes to high school with you that you don't see how beautiful the girl next door is. And as soon as I saw Boston as a possible setting, I was able to write the book. And it ran itself off in fairly short order after that. And I always knew that the book would be fun to write, and it was. As to how I would describe it, well, at the time that I was getting ready to write Cell, that was around the time that I was finishing the work on a novel called Lisey's Story. I was reading a lot of Graham Greene, and I was looking forward to the Steven Spielberg adaptation of War of the Worlds. I was very aware that Graham Greene wrote two kinds of novels. He made a very clear distinction between novels that he called serious novels, what he thought of as his literature, and novels like This Gun for Hire, which the original title of that, not that it matters, was A Gun for Sale when it was published in England. And he called those books entertainments. And I thought to myself, I would like to write a kind of Graham Greene entertainment, but I'd like to cross it with War of the Worlds. I'd like to cross it with that idea of War of the Worlds, because War of the Worlds is a story about one guy, just an ordinary guy, who doesn't understand the larger concepts or the larger science. It's a ground level story about a worldwide cataclysm, and that's what I wanted to do with Cell. I wanted to take one man, who in my book is Clayton Riddell, who's an artist who's just been down to Boston to close a deal for this series of graphic novels that he's written called Dark Wanderer. And this thing happens with the cell phones that's called the Pulse. And everybody who's talking on a cell phone at the time of the Pulse goes crazy, goes homicidal, goes totally rage mad, and starts attacking everybody. Well, of course, what happens in a situation like that is if you see it happening, and if it's not happening to you, and if you have a cell phone, your first impulse is going to be to pick up your cell phone, dial somebody and say, what the hell's going on here, right? And then it happens to you. So it's like a chain letter and it spreads. But Clayton Riddell doesn't have a cell phone, so that doesn't happen to him. But what adapting that H.G. Wells concept for this story did was that it freed me to tell a speculative story on a layman's level. And I really got off on that. So it was terrific from that standpoint. Being able to do that was really terrific. We only learn what happens on a small level, and that's very deliberate. Clayton Riddell meets a number of people, and they travel from Boston to Maine, mostly on foot. It's a distance of probably 170 miles altogether, and I'm not sure it's even believable that they could travel that far on foot. They do some of it in cars, but most of it on foot. But I played with the geography, and so sue me. Anyway, that's the way that the story is told, and I wanted that to stand for everything. And, you know, this is the second time I've destroyed the world in a book. The first time was The Stand in 1979, and frankly, based on the mail that I get, a lot of readers would be perfectly happy if I dropped over dead after I'd written that book, because I hear this thing over and over again. People say, oh, God, I love your books, you're terrific. When are you going to write another book like The Stand? Oh, Stephen, I've got everything you've ever written. When are you going to write another book like The Stand? You know, so after a while, this message kind of gets through. You know, we like The Stand. When are you going to write another book like The Stand? Well, I don't want to go back and repeat myself exactly, but the end of the world is certainly an attractive subject, particularly as times become more and more tense, become more and more complicated, when there's a kind of attraction to a solution that says, again, going in terms of H.G. Wells, the boot heel comes along, destroys the anthill, you have to start all over again. The Stand is a very, very long book. Cell is much, much shorter. It's probably, I'm going to say, 1/3 or even 1/4 the length of The Stand. But The Stand has a kind of a global feel to it. It has probably 30 characters all told that you care about, and Cell has maybe 4 or 5 characters that you care about, and it never really leaves those characters. It just tells their story. It's very, very small. Its ambitions are a lot more focused, and I think that's okay. I just really wanted to get, in movie terms, I wanted to get to a kind of close-up, to an ECU type feeling. So that's what the book does, and microcosm describes macrocosm in this sense. You can figure out that what goes on in Boston in my book is what's going on in Dallas, Fort Worth. It's what's going on in New York City, which I couldn't write about because New Yorkers would say, you got the Battery in the Bronx, and you got Central Park in Harlem, and blah, blah, blah. I think it's interesting that there are some places in the world where this would probably not be going on, or where the effects of the pulse would not be quite as widespread. Certainly the effects of the pulse would not be as serious as they are in some of the built-up civilized, quotes, civilization in quotes, right, areas of America or in China. And of course, as to why I decided to focus on New England, well, they tell you in your earliest writing classes to write about what you know, and that's what I've done most of my life, and really that's what unlocked the whole book for me, was being able to say, Boston, I know Boston. And even then, it's tough, and I know that I'm going to get dozens of outraged letters, maybe even hundreds, from Boston residents who'll say, you got this all wrong. They'll say, Com Ave doesn't go all the way up here, or they'll say, the name of this bridge, and I did get some of the bridges wrong, and finally I put an afterword at the end of the book and said, look, okay, chill out. I, messed around with some of the geography, and sometimes that will cool some people out, but some people just don't get it. There's a constant theme that runs through my science fiction work, okay? I've written a lot of science fiction. I don't call it that as a general rule because I don't really believe in classifying my work or anybody's work. I hate those genre titles. I do. They shelve my work in a section at Borders or Barnes & Noble or Amazon. It says horror. I hate that. I hate that. I think that they do it because it's easy, because it's a pigeonhole, but it's a ghetto. Okay, that's basically it. I see my work in horror, okay? I see Clive Barker's work in horror. I see Dean Koontz's work in horror, and I say, horror? Why don't you call it a gulag, if you're going to call it that? A literary gulag, that's really what it is. So I realized that it's something that the public sort of wants. They want to be able to pick a book the way that they pick a brand of toilet tissue. But I have written a number of books that deal with speculative concepts, and Cell is one of those. The Stand is one of those. Firestarter is another one of those. The Dead Zone is one of those. I think that Carrie is another one. So this is something that I go back to from time to time, and one thing that runs through all of that is the idea, there's a strong distrust of the technology in all of my work. The computer is a valuable tool. I think it serves a valuable purpose in daily life. I don't feel the same way about the cell phone. I don't feel the same way about the little handheld gadgets that people use. I have a friend in the music business whose business manager has a BlackBerry, and the people in his band call it his Crackberry because the guy can't stay off it. This is not an uncommon thing. People become habituated to these tools. People become habituated to their cell phones, and yet, when you think about it, an awful lot of the talk that goes on cell phones is non-substantive talk. A lot of what happens with cell phone usage, it's a whole area of commerce that has been artificially created. It's a kind of a hydroponic culture that serves no real purpose. But at the same time, again, you have to take this as simply my opinion, my bent. Take it with a grain of salt. And I certainly, it's like the man says, it's my opinion. It may not be yours, but technology makes me uneasy. And if I can put it in short form, I just say that one of the reasons that technology makes me uneasy is because I believe that our ability to build gadgets like cell phones, with their ability to take pictures, their ability to text message, to download faxes, and all the rest of these things, those abilities have far outraced our moral compass and our ability to control our bad habits. That's why you give somebody a cell phone, 10 minutes later they're going to be downloading porn on it. And 20 minutes after that, somebody's going to tap it. So yeah, I'm very distrustful. Cell phones are here to stay, I think. And it does seem like everyone has one. One of the things that I pointed out in Cell is that there are as many cell phones in mainland China as there are people in the United States of America. That's an amazing statistic when you stop and think about it. So it does seem like almost everyone has one. And I can remember very clearly walking down a street in New York City about 10 years ago and seeing someone walk toward me coming the other way and thinking to myself, oh God, this guy is crazy. Well, you get used to seeing crazy people on the streets of large cities, people who are walking along and talking to themselves, and this guy was clearly angry. He was talking and jabbing at the air, gesticulating. The difference was that usually when you see somebody on the street who looks crazy, they're somebody that's dressed in old clothes and pushing a shopping cart, and they've got their pants legs tied down to keep the bad germs out, and sometimes they're wearing maybe a tinfoil hat to keep the bad alien rays off their heads. This guy was turned out in a perfect suit, and he was clearly an upwardly mobile gentleman. And as we got closer, and I'm way out on the outside of the sidewalk so I can dart across the street if he makes a grab for me, I see that the reason he's talking to himself is that he's really not talking to himself. You've guessed, right? He's got a headpiece on and he's got one of those little tiny microphones. He's talking on a mobile phone. And now you see people on the streets all the time who are gabbling away on cell phones. You see people at ballparks that are gabbling away on cell phones. They have announcements at the beginning of movies telling you to turn off your cell phones because people forget. They've made a huge impact on our culture. As for why I don't own one, to me, cell phones, pardon me, I know that I'm speaking on a podcast to a lot of people who own cell phones, but to me, a cell phone is like a slave bracelet, okay? Basically, once you have one, anybody who wants you can reach out and grab you by the neck or by the earlobe. I can remember as a child what a teacher used to do when he or she was angry with you was to grab you by the ear and drag you to the front of the room or out in the hall. And that's what a cell phone does when it rings. It grabs you by the ear and turns you into its creature. And I don't like that. I don't like beepers. I don't like cell phones. I don't like Blackberries. I don't like anything that puts me in a position of being at somebody's beck and call. When I think of cell phones, I think of those tracker gadgets that prosecutors put on flight risks who are out on bail from high-profile criminal proceedings. So I just don't like them. And I don't think, frankly, that they're a gadget that has much practical use once you get outside the emergency services like fire, police, emergency response. They're a commodity that's basically, it's a created thing. It's a created necessity. Well, let's leave it at that. My books do have a certain diversity, I guess. Even though you do have a tendency to see them all lumped together as horror, you can even find on writing in the horror section if you look. But sure, there are all kinds of things that I would like to try that I never have. I think that's true of anybody. And there are any number of reasons why I haven't, but I suspect the two biggies are laziness and inadequacy, fear of failure. Laziness in the sense that what I'm thinking about is nonfiction. I would like to try someday, I think, to write a true crime book or to write a book that dealt with crime in a sociological sense. But I have made myself a very comfortable living writing fiction. I enjoy using my imagination. It's very difficult to let go of that. My tendency is to go on. I've written a couple of books of nonfiction, and I know that it's very difficult when somebody says, you can't fall back on your imagination. You actually might have to look things up. But at the same time, I know that it's really good to get out of your day-to-day, I don't want to call it a rut, your day-to-day routine. How's that? So I've written a column for Entertainment Weekly for the past 2.5 years, and that's been intensely valuable. One of the things that getting out of a routine does is it exposes you to a different part of the forest, and you do find yourself reaping rewards from that. I know that for me, I used to think that I was plugged into the popular culture until I got into the Entertainment Weekly column, and then I discovered some people who were really plugged into the popular culture, and I started to feel very old-fashioned indeed. And I started to actually work a little bit harder at rediscovering the currents in my culture. And I think that Cell benefited from that to a degree. So it's always good to try something new. I would like to try a true crime book. I'd like to try, I think maybe... I've always thought to myself, you're going to laugh at this, and it's going to be the last thing that I'm going to say on this interview, so maybe I will leave you with a chuckle. I would like to go back to school. I would like to learn to speak and write French better than I can now, and I think that it would be wonderful to be able to write a novel in French, to be able to write a novel in another language and actually see it translated into English. I can now read French quite well, and I can write French on the level of, let's say, maybe a 4th or 5th grader, which is humbling. And I can't speak it at all. People laugh when I try because I have no accent. But I would like to learn to write it well enough to write a book. I think that would be a terrific thing to be able to do. Having said that, I will just say thank you for listening to me, and bonjour.